Good evening, everybody. Meeting is called to order. May I now request our President, Dr. Kannan, to deliver the welcome address.
Good evening, friends, respected patrons, KRP sir, Bala sir, senior members of ISG, teachers, guest speaker Professor Vineet Ahuja from Delhi, AIMS Delhi, colleagues, students and friends. It gives me great pleasure in inviting you all for our monthly meeting. Today we have interesting cases for presentation, followed by the inauguration of the Tamil Nadu IABD forum, where we have lectures and panel discussions. You can see the improvement in our monthly meetings. Our secretary has nicely molded all the speakers into giving interesting names to the twist of the fate, abdominal aquarium, happy ending to UGI bleeding. Ubal has motivated everybody in the attractive terminologies. At this juncture, I would like to thank you all for making me an office bearer, and especially I would like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Prem Kumar and Ubal. This will be the last welcome address I'll be giving. I'll be handing over in the next annual conference to Maladi Madam. Thank you. Welcome you all.
Next, we move on to the PG session. May I request the chairpersons, Dr. Venkatakrishnan, Dr. Bhaktavachalam, Dr. A.C. Arun, and Dr. Palanivel Mohan to come out to the dais and take over and conduct the proceedings. Dr. Venkatakrishnan. Oh, sorry. Sir, inga vandrunga sir. Sir. LVK sir. Sir. Inga sir.
Can we have the, good evening, can we have the first case presentation? Cecal EST in a patient with post-anti-resection and cirrhosis from the Department of Global Hospitals.
Good evening, everyone. Today, on behalf of Medical Gastroenterology Department of Clinical Global Health City, I'll be presenting a case of endoscopic submucal dissection for a cecal lesion in a cirrhotic patient who had undergone low anterior resection for CA rectum. So the history goes somewhat like this. A 63-year-old male with no family history of colonic carcinoma, who was a diabetic for last 25 years, diagnosed as stage 1 CKD 3 years back. His baseline creatinine was about 1.4 always, with a performance status of 0. In April 2019, he was evaluated for bleeding PR and constipation. A sigmoidoscopy was done, and he was diagnosed to have a rectosigmoid growth. Biopsy was done, which was suggestive of moderately differentiated adenocarcinoma. CT abdomen was done, which was suggestive of localized disease only, and incidentally it was picked up as a cirrhotic liver was picked up. And his labs at that time showed him to be of child status B. So all these investigations and management was done in an outside hospital from Kerala, where he was referred to us. 2 months later, he was advised by an oncologist to undergo neoadjuvant chemotherapy plus surgery. But because of his child B status, he was deemed unfit for chemotherapy and he underwent laparoscopic low anterior resection. He had uneventful post-operative period and later discharged. 4 months later, a patient developed abdominal pain and increased stool frequency. Initially, his CEA was 6.9. On evaluation in the outside hospital, his CEA was found to be 8.2, and they had done a PET CT, which was showing a polypoidal lesion in ascending colon with increased uptake, probably suspected to be malignant. So they went ahead and did colonoscopy, and they identified multiple small polyps less than 1 centimeter in the transverse colon, which were all removed, and also a large cecal polyp was detected, which was measuring about 3 centimeter. They did not do polypectomy for same, fearing perforation, and they referred the case here. But a biopsy of the cecal polyp was done, which was showing tubulovillous adenoma with high-grade dysplasia. All other small polyps were showing tubulovillous adenoma with low-grade dysplasia. So the patient now came to us with a performance status of 0 and child B status, INR of 1.45, platelet 1.26 lakhs, total bilirubin 2.2, albumin 3.2, and a creatinine of 1.6. So multidisciplinary tumor board meet was conducted, and eventually a patient was planned for endoscopic submucal dissection. So a pre-ESD colonoscopy was done. So here we can see we have used Olympus 190 colonoscope to evaluate before actually going for the ESD procedure. So we were cleaning the lesion as well to remove any residual fecal matter. And the lesion here shows on NBI vascular pattern with variable caliber and irregular distribution, and also the irregular and obscure surface pattern can be seen. So this is actually suggestive of either high-grade intramucosal dysplasia or superficial submucosal invasion. So this was falling into Japanese NBI expert team classification type 2B. This type 2B was later actually classified by Shinji Tanaka et al. Into type 2B low and type 2B high. And the patient the lesion exhibited uniform thickness and a uniform distribution of irregular vessels and pit pattern irregularity with a smooth surface. So it was falling into type 2B low. And the same study also showed that lesions which are type 2B low have 92% sensitivity to detect mucosal invasion alone. And lesions which are type 2B high have 89% sensitivity to say that they are superficial submucosal involvement. So Japanese Gastrointestinal Endoscopy Society gives guidelines that those lesions which are type 2B low can be managed with endoscopic treatment alone. They do not require any chromoendoscopy with magnification. If it is type 2B high, we can either do chromoendoscopy and Kudopit identification, but which we are not doing. But the patient anyway was type 2B low, candidate for endoscopic treatment, and also the outside biopsy was showing tubulovillous adenoma with high-grade dysplasia. So we proceeded with ESE. Pre-procedure, patient was given bowel preparation, split peg leg preparation. INR was 1.22 after vitamin K correction, and platelet was 1,34,000. Patient was intubated, and procedure was performed under general anesthesia in left lateral position, and prophylactic antibiotic of cephalosporin was given. So the instruments that we used was a dual knife J of Olympus and Avis Exera JF HQ 190 adult scope. So the diagnostic endoscopy, we used a colonoscope, and for performing ESD, the preferred scope is pediatric colonoscope, but which is not available in our center. So we used 190 adult gastroscope, OGD scope, and also 21 gauge sclerotherapy needle for creating the mucosal cushion and submucosal dissection. And the medium which we used for creating the mucosal cushion was succinylate gelatin, and that is Jellofusion, that is mixed with methylene blue. Along with that, coagrasper and hemoclips were used. CO2 insufflator and water irrigation jet and RB electrosurgical unit was used. So after delineating the lesion, the clear lesion, we need to have some clear lesion to be present because en bloc resection is needed. So we use NBI to mark out the area. Then sclerotherapy injection needle is injected, and we keep injecting the material, that is Jellofusion diluted with methylene blue. And once the cushion is sufficiently elevated, we start mucosal incision. So some studies have found that those lesions which are present near the cecum, starting dissection from anal side is better. But here we proceeded with dissection from anal side itself. One point to remember is that it is difficult for cecal lesions to start incision as the scope comes perpendicular to the lesion. and also there is a thin wall, so there is high chance of perforation. So we see that we are making a circumferential incision, mucosal incision all around. And the mode we used was endocut Q, effect 3, duration 2 with interval of 4. So once the circumferential incision has been made, we can slowly start the submucosal dissection. Now we are injecting, we are creating a submucosal bleb and then carefully dissecting. The succinylated gelatin which we inject has some advantages. There is reported less incidence of bleeding and perforation with it, as the transmitted coagulation force is less to the adjacent structures. And along with that, there is decreased incidence of post-polypectomy syndrome. So as we dissect, we have to be careful, because if by chance we injure the muscularis propria, then there will be perforation. So we see that there are small vessels that bleeding can be controlled by using coagulation with the same dual knife. If a large vessel is encountered, we have to change the accessory. A coagrasper can be used. Until that time, we can give mechanical tamponade using the needle scope tip, scope cap hood. So once the bleeding has been controlled, we are again dissecting carefully, injecting and then dissecting carefully to avoid the muscularis propria damage. If there is severe bleeding that cannot be managed even with coagrasper, then we need to clip, use a hemoclip. So careful dissection across the submucosal tissue has to be carried out. As we discussed, muscularis propria is very thin, and if any by chance we detect any defect in between, we have to intervene immediately, either place a kip. So now we are dissecting almost the last pedicle of the polypoidal lesion. That is the other side of the mucosa, which we can see, the normal mucosa. And once the dissection is complete, this is the last part of the pedicle. Once the dissection is complete, we have to be careful, and we should carefully examine the site. Judiciously, we should examine the site for any bleeding or defects in the muscularis propria. So if any defect is addressed, then we have to treat it immediately, either with clipping. So now we are closely seeing if there is any bleeding or if there is any defect. Small vessel bleeding can be controlled with coagulation directly. If there is a big vessel that is bleeding, we can use a coagrasper or a clip. So there are some studies, the lesion which we dissected was more than 2 centimeter. So some studies quote that if the defect is more than 2 centimeter, better to clip prophylactically, especially in cecal lesions, because that will prevent secondary bleeding, and also delayed perforation can be prevented. So now after we are extracting the lesion with a snare polyp, and once extracted, we pinned it to a cardboard and then used formalin and sent it to the lab. So we can see it is almost measuring 2.8 to 3 centimeter. So a review of ESD. Definitely EMR is a precursor of ESD. It was first described by Hiro et al. In Japan for gastric lesions. They were aggressively screening for gastric carcinoma, and they were diagnosing early gastric cancers, for which they employed ESD as treatment. But it was in 1999 and 2001, around that time, when they extended this procedure to colonic lesions as well. But it was only in 2012 that this procedure was approved by the Japanese health scheme system. So indication of for ESD in colonic lesions as per the Japanese health and coronary insurance system include the lesion should be well differentiated and probably restricted to mucosal cancer if it is less than 5 centimeter. And a laterally spreading tumor, which is a subtype of Paris 0 type 2A classification, that is again divided into granular, non-granular, nodular or mixed type. If it is greater than 2 centimeter, that is also an indication. Or a sessile polyp, which is suspected to be an edema with underlying fibrosis. So if underlying fibrosis is there, definitely ESD is preferred over EMR. Even the European Society of Gastrointestinal Endoscopy states that lesions with a high suspicion of limited submucosal invasion, they can be treated with ESD. And similarly, if it is more than 2 centimeter with irregular or non-granular surface pattern, that is laterally spreading tumor, that can also be resected using ESD. Lesions that otherwise cannot be optimally and radically removed using snare-based techniques can have to be addressed by ESD, because there is a non-lifting sign that when we inject any material to lift the mucosal surface, and if it is not lifting, that means there is some infiltration into submucosa, then ESD is the preferred method. So the wall structure The superficial layer basically up to SM1, we say that for colon, 1000 micron of SM, that is 1000 micron depth SM1, the invasion into the lymphovascular system is less than 1% as the study states. So it is that till SM1, if the invasion is there, ESD can be done. And in case the lesion is even in mucosa, but size is greater than 2 centimeter, preferable to do ESD rather than EMR. So mucosal lesion, EMR can be done, but more than 2 centimeter, preferably ESD. And till SM1, lesion has to be addressed with ESD. But if it is deep submucosal invasion, surgery is the preferred modality of treatment. So comparing EMR and ESD, both are highly effective. EMR has got a moderate recurrence rate and ESD has very low recurrence rate. EMR is comparatively faster and widely available, and ESD is very time consuming, technically more demanding. Lower complications with EMR, whereas ESD is associated with higher complications. So this systemic review by Arezzo et al. In 2016. So broadly what they have suggested is that the en bloc resection rate for ESD is 92%, whereas for EMR it is 52%. And R0 resection is 82 to 92% in ESD and 40 to 44% EMR. And recurrence rate is only 0.8%, whereas it is 5 to 6.4% in EMR. So definitely here ESD scores well over EMR. This is an older data in 2010, which with almost similar results, but here recurrence rate result is not there. So eventually, if it is in the superficial submucosal layer, or the lesion is greater than 2 centimeter, ESD is preferred. If there is deep invasion, more than superficial submucosal layer or lymphovascular invasion is there, surgery is the preferred modality. Now comparing colonic ESD with other ESD. So gastric lesions have a wide lumen, whereas colonic ESD have a narrow tubular lumen and greater angulation at the flexures, and also there is a thinner muscular layer in colon. So these factors make endoscopic control and maneuverability difficult. And also colorectal region, ESD, the degree of difficulty also varies. For example, in rectum, there will be a lot of vessels, retroflexion is required, and caution is to be taken to prevent bleeding. Sigmoid colon, the lumen is narrow. Descending colon, the maneuverability is difficult and splenic flexion moves with respiration. In transverse colon, there will be paradoxical movement in certain areas. Ascending colon, the wall is very thin, and cecum also the wall is very thin, and knife actually doesn't come tangentially, it comes perpendicularly. So that difficulty is there. Cecum is very difficult to approach. So complications include immediate, that is procedural related bleeding and perforation, and delayed include delayed perforation. So there is also delayed bleeding which can be seen in 1.5 to 2.8% cases, that is defined by a decrease in hemoglobin greater than 2 gram or confirmation of marked hemorrhage between 2 and 7 days after the operation. Also reported complications are polypectomy, electrocoagulation syndrome, and fulminant necrotizing fasciitis. One other thing is how do we send the specimen? So once the specimen is resected, we should not directly put it into the formalin. We should pin it to the cardboard so that it is easy for the pathologist to examine the underlying how much depth we have resected. So this is our patient. Since the tumor was very big, this is the base which we have pinned to the cardboard, and we can see that en bloc resection, macroscopically it is free, and later on the biopsy, only the mucosal layer was showing tubulovillosadenoma with high-grade dysplasia. Submucosal layer, there was only some infiltration, not infiltration, only some inflammatory cells. That can be due to ESD procedure itself. So that was R0 resection. So now the patient, we are called him for a repeat screening that is yet to be done. He's yet to turn up. So to conclude, this procedure is from the east, the west is picking up. Indian data is not much available, and we need much data and studies to be done. So the patient who had presented to us with multiple comorbidities, CTBB, cirrhosis, CKD, and already a post-surgical candidate, we had offered to him curative result with R0 resection. Sir, that is actually an issue, sir, that even we couldn't find. That was a problem. Probably only based on CT they have done. Colonoscopy was not done. That was a problem. Otherwise, that lesion appearing within 3 months of the surgery is...
Because if you had done the colonoscopy, the initial situation found 2 lesions, the treatment would have been different, isn't it?
Yes.
So what is the time difference between low anterior resection and the second picking up of this lesion? The PET CT that you told picked
Yeah.
up this lesion. What is the time difference between the first surgery and this one?
4 months, sir.
So because this is a large lesion, the previous CT, did you go back to the previous CT and see? Because 2 centimeters lesion would have been picked up by CT itself.
Only the data, like the details were available as a discharge summary. The patient in per se presented to us only for the lesion resection.
If the patient is not having cirrhosis,
Okay, sir.
would you still consider ESD or will you go for resection? Because in cecal lesion it's very difficult to assess whether the invasion is there or not before pre-operatively, and there is still a chance that there may be an invasion.
Sir, if
If it is a low risk candidate, what would be your option?
Sir, if preoperatively biopsy is there, like this patient had high-grade dysplasia, but we don't know whether only one part has been biopsied, other parties can also. So NBI evaluation, one thing we can do, and if we are doing ESD, we should actually get an en bloc resection, and in that if there is infiltration, then he has to proceed for surgery.
No, your NBI should be able to give you whether there's a
Yes, sir.
submucosal invasion or not.
Yes, sir.
It gives you an idea whether it's SM1 or SM2 by the Japanese classification. Based on the surface, you can say it's an SM1 as well. Still SM1, it's probably we can go for an ESD. Mahadevan, you think this polyp is quite ambulant? Do you think EMR would have suggested it because your biopsy has not shown any submucosal this one?
So
And your NBI is also a low thing for.
actually, it looks like it's there in the fold. Actually, basically, it maybe would have done with the piecemeal EMR would have been possible. But still, there is a risk of perforation. Other things will be there. That's a fear. For that, only patient was referred for ESD. But ESD will have a en bloc resection. Actually,
Because
that's
Japanese always believe ESD. But if you look at the Michael Borg series, he says some of these lesions can be done with a now underwater EMR. That's what I think. But Japanese always believe it's ESD actually.
This en bloc resection, I don't think it's possible with this
With
lesion.
EMR, agreed. Can we go?
Thank you, sir.
We'll move on to the next case. Happy ending to UGI bleed by Dr. Sujata.
అయ్యో పాయింటర్ இருக்கா இதுல எது Good evening to my teachers and friends. I am going to present a 53 years male who is a known case of alcoholic DCLD and who presented to us with 3 days of melena. History of presenting illness, he had 3 days of melena. There is no history of blood vomiting, no history of abdomen pain, no history of yellowish discoloration of eyes or urine, no history of abdomen distension or leg swelling, no history of decreased urine output, no history of fever or breathlessness or loss of weight or loss of appetite. Past history, he is a known case of alcoholic DCLD with portal hypertension, diagnosed in 2017. The first time presentation was UGI bleed. Since then, in the past 2 years, he has undergone multiple times of glue injection for UGI bleed. And the last admission was 4 months before this admission, that is on September 2019, with UGI bleed, hematemesis, and he underwent glue injection for a large bleeding GOV2. He has no other comorbidities. He was an alcoholic for 25 years. He used to take brandy daily for 180 ml per day, and he stopped drinking since 2017. He is not a smoker. His general examination was normal, except that he was paler. And the abdomen examination, oral cavity, inspection, palpation, percussion, auscultation, everything was normal. He didn't have any ascites. Baseline blood investigations, hemoglobin was 7.9 and platelet count was 90,000, and he had AG reversal. We did OGD, which showed 3-column small esophageal varix without any red color signs, and large fundal varix, GOV2. So now we have a patient with recurrent fundal variceal bleed, and these are all the options we had. So to decide about the further line of management, we did CT angio abdomen for this patient, which showed a large gastrorenal shunt, as we see here, that drains the gastric fundal varix. So since the patient had a large fundal varix with a gastrorenal shunt, after discussing with our interventional radiologist, we decided to proceed with PRTO, that is vascular plug-assisted retrograde transvenous obliteration. And it goes like, we went through the right femoral approach. As we see here, through the right femoral iliac and IVC cannulation, we cannulate the left renal vein and then the gastrorenal shunt, which drains the gastric varix here. Gastrorenal shunt drains the gastric varix in 85% of the cases. It's the most common efferent vein. So then a 10 French sheet is placed in the gastrorenal shunt, and a vascular plug is deployed in the shunt, followed by a 4 French catheter is negotiated behind the vascular plug, and a gel foam slurry is injected through the distal catheter, and then the catheter is removed, leaving the vascular plug there. So this is how it was done. The video shows a 10 French catheter that is placed in the gastrorenal shunt. Here we can see the vascular plug already deployed, it's in the shunt, and a distal catheter is placed. Here the gel foam slurry, that is the hand-cut gel foam sheet mixed with a contrast agent is injected into the gastrorenal shunt, and here we can see the gastric varix. Yes, this is the gastric varix. So follow-up, 1 month after the procedure, we did OGD, and we can notice that the fundal varix size has come down nicely. And follow-up CT angiography abdomen was done 1 week later, which showed vascular plug in situ with thrombosed gastrorenal shunt. This is before the procedure, this is after the procedure. And this shows the thrombosed gastric fundal varix after the procedure. So discussion, gastric varices are seen in 10 to 30% of patients with portal hypertension. Though they bleed less frequently than the esophageal varix, the mortality rate is very high, and also the rebleeding risk is high after the endoscopic cyanoacrylate injection. The primary prophylaxis for gastric varix, non-selective beta blocker forms the first line. Glue injection or EUS guided vascular therapy are under studies, and for secondary prophylaxis, we prefer TIPS over non-selective beta blocker, and EUS guided vascular therapy or PARTO are under studies. For acute gastric variceal bleed, these are all the various options: endoscopic cyanoacrylate injection, TIPS, EUS guided coil with or without glue injection, hemostatic powder, and BRTO or PARTO. So as we know, BRTO is an endovascular approach that embolizes the shunt outflow by occluding the shunt per se with an occlusion balloon, followed by injection of sclerosing agent into the variceal complex. So these are all the various modified techniques of BRTO. Both the anterograde and retrograde approaches are there. Retrograde approach is what we saw now through the left renal vein, and the anterograde approach is done by the portal venous approach. This figure shows the pathophysiology of portosystemic shunts, and this is the portal vein flow, and these are all the portosystemic shunts. This is where the occlusion is done in this procedure. So coming to complications, worsening of the esophageal varix is the most common reported complication till date in the literature, that is 20 to 45%. Next common is ascites. Remaining rest everything are very less reported, like portal vein thrombosis or left renal vein thrombosis, migration of the vascular plug, infection, or recanalization of the gastric varix or gastrorenal shunt. So why do we prefer Parto over BRTO? There are few reasons that there is less procedure time for Parto than BRTO. For BRTO, it takes 4 to 20 hours, and for Parto, depending on the expertise, it can be 20 minutes, and maximum time reported in the literature is 68 minutes. So the procedure-related complications are also less with Parto when compared to BRTO. Like in BRTO, we can have balloon rupture, sclerosant leak into the systemic circulation, DIC, hemolysis, pulmonary embolism, and acute renal failure, anaphylactic reactions. All these things are not seen with Parto. And the gel foam provides rapid and complete embolization of the shunt, and there is no need to selectively embolize the efferent vein, unlike Parto, to prevent the sclerosant leak into the systemic circulation. So I'd like to conclude with a few literature. It's a study from Boston, published in 2018 with 161 patients, and they say that the rebleeding rate at 1 year is more. Actually, it compares endoscopic cyanoacrylate injection with the BRTO. They say the rebleeding rate at 1 year is higher with endoscopic cyanoacrylate injection than BRTO, when the 1 year mortality rate is almost same in both of them. It's a Korean study with 20 patients. Here, it's a Parto study. Here they have done Parto for gastric varices, either bleeding, actively bleeding, or as a secondary prophylaxis, and in patients with chronic hepatic encephalopathy, chronic refractory hepatic encephalopathy. They say that the post-procedure, the liver function has some improvement in the form of decrease in bilirubin, as we see here, and decrease in INR, and increase in albumin level. They also say the clinical and technical success rate is almost 100%. So these are all 5 studies. The table summarizes 5 studies of Parto. As I said, the mean procedure time varies according to the technical expertise. All these are, though all these are smaller studies, the technical and clinical success rate is almost 100%. And as I said, the most common reported complication is worsening of esophageal varix. This study is from Europe in published in 2015. Done among with 95 patients. It compares BRTO with Parto, and we can see the technical and clinical success rate with Parto is 92 to 93%, and it is 100% with Parto. This study nicely summarizes the where we can do BRTO, Parto, CARTO, or BARTO. That is, Parto is preferred in all the patients who are fit for BRTO. Parto is most desired and most used, most studied techniques among these. And CARTO is used whenever Parto is not possible, that whenever the shunt size is very large, that is more than 25 mm, they are telling vascular plug size is not there, we can't do it. And shunt angle, if it is incompatible to cannulate, then we can do CARTO. BATO is used whenever the patient doesn't have gastrorenal shunt. So to conclude, Parto is preferred over BRTO. It's a safe alternative to TIPS, both as a secondary prophylaxis and in patients with acute gastric variceal bleed. One more indication for Parto they are telling is chronic and refractory hepatic encephalopathy. So there is no head-to-head comparison study which compares Parto with US guided vascular therapy. More RCTs are needed to compare their safety and efficacy. Thank you.
Really a novel presentation. And this patient was followed up. How long this process?
That follow-up OGD 4 weeks later I showed, sir. It was done 3 days back, sir.
When the procedure was done?
In January, sir.
In January.
Yes, sir.
So long-term follow-up in studies, how it is?
Maximum they have followed the patient up to 2 years, sir. Till now, the Parto studies, whatever till now studies, 4 patients they are telling there is a recanalization is there. And intermediate and long-term worsening of esophageal varix risk is there. 2 years is the maximum follow-up they have done till date.
Right.
So would you like to recommend it in the first go itself for fundal varices or only in refractory cases?
Is there any literature between US guided coiling of
No,
this
sir. No, sir.
fundal
There is
varix
no
versus
head-to-head
this?
comparison. US guided coiling, they are telling the success rate is 80 to 90%.
Now, US guided coiling is now, you can inject through the US
Yes, sir.
coils into that.
Yes, sir.
I think, so you can combine it whether with a glue or just use only a
Yes, sir.
coiling.
Or both together.
Sometimes
Coil
you
with
think.
glue.
Initially, the US guided coiling came up for ectopic varices in the small valve.
Yes, sir.
But now we have started injecting, doing US guided coiling for thing. That seems to have a 90%, this one.
Yes, sir.
I think in few years' time, probably, now Bin Molar has done an US guided tips, and he is now publishing his results shortly. So I think we must really get an expert where US guided tips can be placed as a adjuncting therapy. If there are no questions, thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you,
a
sir.
good presentation. Abdominal aquarium from Dr. Kushan Sen Gupta from Apollo Hospitals.
Good evening, respected teachers and my dear colleagues. I would like to thank TNISG for giving me this opportunity to present this case. So I'll be presenting the case of abdominal aquarium. So it's basically regarding a male patient, a 47 years old male patient. He is coming from Bangladesh. He's a businessman by occupation. He presented to us with the presenting complaints of abdominal pain and fever for the past 20 days. So going on to the history of presenting illness, the abdominal pain was there for the past 20 days. It was like insidious in onset and progressive, and it was a dull aching right upper quadrant type of pain. It was not radiating, it was not related to food intake or posture. And it decreased with analgesics only to come back again after the effect of the analgesics waned off. Regarding the fever also accompanied abdominal pain. It was intermittent type of fever, high grade, and it was associated with chills and rigor. It used to subside with antipyretics. There was no diurnal variation, and it was not associated with cough, shortness of breath, headache, burning micturition, rash, or joint pains. So there was also a history of anorexia and weight loss of around 2 kgs over this period of 20 days. There was history of nausea, but there was no vomiting. There was no history of abdominal distension, pedal edema, jaundice, GI bleed, or loose stools. Past history, the patient did not have any previous surgeries and also any endoscopic procedures in the past. And he was a hypertensive, so he was on treatment for that for the past 1 year. He is a chronic cigarette smoker and an alcoholic for the past 10 years, and his alcohol intake varied between 90 to 180 ml. He takes it once in 2 weeks. So he was treated in Bangladesh, and he was told to have some infection in the abdomen, for which he received antibiotics, and in spite of that, he didn't get relief of his symptoms, so he came to Apollo Hospital. So on examination, the patient was conscious, oriented, he was vitally stable, but he was febrile, and there was no pallor icterus, pedal edema, clubbing, or lymphadenopathy. Perabdominal examination showed the abdomen was non-protuberant, and there was tenderness in the right hypochondrium, and there was hepatomegaly 4 centimeters below the right costal margin. Examination-wise, there was no free fluid, and there were normal bowel sounds. Other systemic examination was normal. So at the end of our history and In the physical examination, the first diagnosis that came to our mind was liver abscess. The second diagnosis that we thought of could be a hydatid disease of liver, but generally they present with low grade of fever. This patient had high grade of fever. And the third but remote possibility we kept as cholecystitis or cholangitis, but in this patient he did not have jaundice, and the abdominal pain characteristics were also not quite fitting into cholecystitis or cholangitis. So we went on to the investigations. The investigations on the day 1, it showed the total leukocyte counts showed leukocytosis with neutrophilic predominance, and it was like 29,000. The thrombocytosis was also present, and the SGOT was 138, SGPT was 234, and the alkaline phosphatase was also elevated. It was 375. The albumin was 3.1, and there was also an element of AKI, most related possibly to sepsis. The ESR was elevated, it was 63, and the INR was 1.57. So the blood cultures were sent during that time, but they didn't show any growth. The chest X-ray, it didn't show any pleural effusion, but the ultrasound abdomen, it was suggestive of a liver abscess that was 9.7 into 8.8 centimeter in the posterior superior aspect of the right lobe. And there was also splenomegaly with contracted GB, and there was minimal right pleural effusion. So the patient was started on empirical antibiotics, and since the size of the hepatic abscess was more than 5 centimeter, we went in for ultrasound guided pigtail aspiration. The pus was sent, and the pus grew Staphylococcus capitis, and it was sensitive to ertapenem, so the patient was started on ertapenem. But after 2 to 3 days of antibiotic therapy also, the patient continued to have fever and pain in the abdomen. And also we were not quite sure about the cause of the pyogenic liver abscess that patient had. So we wanted to rule out whether he has any biliary pathology or whether he has any other abdominal source because of which he got this liver abscess. So we went ahead with the CECT abdomen. The CECT abdomen showed cystic lesions in the liver, mainly involving the segments 4, 5, 7, and 8. So it was basically abscess on CT. There was also the pigtail that could be seen, and there was also a small GB calculus. But what was interesting is that there was a foreign body that was found in, it was extruding out from the pyloroanteric region of the stomach, and it was going into the caudate lobe of the liver. And it was possible that the foreign body had penetrated the stomach and caused the liver abscess. So the CECT was suggestive of a liver abscess measuring 7.5 into 12 into 9.4 centimeter. And there was also a foreign body that was seen extruding from the pylorus of the stomach up to the caudate lobe of the liver alongside the abscess. So after we got this CT abdomen, the same day the patient, we planned to go for a endoscopy, upper GI endoscopy, to find out whether whether we can find any fistulous communication between the abscess and the stomach, and to also to know what is the kind of the foreign body that the patient had ingested, because he didn't give us any history of foreign body ingestion in the past. So going on to the endoscopy. So we were in the body of the stomach, and we were mainly focusing on the antrum and the pylorus of the stomach. And as we can see that there were some food particles, and apart from that we cannot see any fistulous opening. Also there is no point of entry of the foreign body that can be found out. So there was some food particles sticking, so we gave a thorough wash and we examined again, but unfortunately we were not able to find out any foreign body. So next the patient was taken up for surgery, and the surgery showed a foreign body that was coming out from the pylorus of the stomach, and it was going into the caudate lobe of the liver. So this is the foreign body. And so this is the picture of the surgery after the removal of the foreign body. And what was interesting is the kind of foreign body that it was. So it was basically a fish bone that he had ingested, and without his knowledge, the fish bone it penetrated into his stomach, and then it went into the liver. So basically, he had a laparoscopic removal of the foreign body, and the lavage was done for the abscess. And the fish bone, it measured approximately 3.5 into 2 centimeter. And there were also omental adhesions to the inferior surface of the liver and granulation tissue, and minimal pus was present around the fish bone. So after the surgery, the post-op period was quite uneventful. The patient was discharged on the next day with the course of antibiotic, and he was followed up after 1 month, and so far he is doing good. So going on to the review of literature, the formation of liver abscess secondary to foreign body ingestion is extremely rare, and foreign bodies that have been reported in literature, they range from toothpicks, fish bone, needles, chicken bones, pens, and dentures. So the first case of hepatic abscess secondary to GI perforation caused by foreign body was reported by Lambert in 1898, and so far 88 cases of hepatic abscesses caused by foreign body ingestion have been published. And the most common cause of foreign body causing liver abscess through the GI is the fish bone, approximately 33%. The second most common is the toothpick. Third most common is the chicken bone, and then the needle. The stomach is the most common site of perforation, constituting around 41%, followed by the duodenum, followed by the colon. And regarding the location of the hepatic abscess, the left lobe of the liver was the most common site affected, followed by the right lobe, and bilobar involvement was also found in 4.5% of the patients. So liver abscess secondary to foreign body penetration of the GI tract should be ruled out whenever we are encountering a lesion without an identifiable underlying condition combined with a treatment failure, as was in our case. Generally, when we encounter a case of liver abscess, the most common organisms that grow are Klebsiella or E. coli, but in cases of foreign body related abscess, Streptococcus is the most common organism found, followed by E. coli and Klebsiella. But in our case, it was Staphylococcus capitis. So Go et al. In their study, they postulated that it is possible that a thicker gut wall causes the foreign body to perforate more gradually, and the close proximity of the omentum and adjacent organ, such as the liver, assist in sealing the perforation site. So this results in the formation of the liver abscess. And these are the different routes of perforation of the foreign body, and through these routes, the foreign body goes into the liver. The most common symptoms that are encountered in these lesions are abdominal pain in 77% of the cases, and fever in 58% of the cases. And history of foreign body ingestion is interestingly found only in 5% of the patients. The rest 95% don't give a positive history. So the investigations that was done in this case series, the CT scan clinched the diagnosis in around 60% of the cases, ultrasound clinched the diagnosis in around 23% of the cases, followed by X-ray and laparotomy. So timely surgical exploration is recommended for patients with diagnostic uncertainties, and endoscopy may aid in the diagnosis when it is performed at an early stage before complete migration of the foreign body and the mucosal healing. In our case, the foreign body had completely migrated and the mucosa looked completely normal, so therefore the endoscopy could not find the foreign body. So the treatment is mainly the removal of the foreign body and drainage of the hepatic abscess. So hepatic abscess that are related to foreign body migration, the overall cure without foreign body removal is quite low. It's like 9.5%. And as means for removing the foreign body, laparoscopic surgery is very useful in cases in which it is present at the liver margin. So this is the table from the article in which they had done the case series. And the surgery, it removed the foreign body in around 70% of the cases, and endoscopic intervention also around 10 case reports were there in which endoscopic intervention was done. So upper GI endoscopy removed the foreign body in 4, colonoscopy 4, sigmoidoscopy 1, and in one case they had to go for single balloon enteroscopy. So this is just the algorithm for the management of liver abscess. So whenever we have a patient in whom we suspect to have liver abscess, we go for an imaging. That imaging, mostly we use ultrasound or CT, along with the associated findings like GB stone, CBD stone, or malignancy, and the lab investigations with elevated WBC count and deranged LFT also support the diagnosis. Next, we go for amoebic serology. So if it is positive and the abscess is mainly on the right side of the liver and it is single, then it is most likely amoebic liver abscess, in which case the patient needs to be treated with metronidazole. And if the patient does not respond with medical treatment and the abscess is on the left side, so in that case we need to go for drainage. As for pyogenic liver abscess, they need to be treated on broad spectrum antibiotics, and if the abscess is less than 5 centimeter, then needle aspiration can be done. If it is more than 5 centimeter, then percutaneous drainage needs to be done. And also the primary cause of the abscess needs to be addressed. Like in our case, it was foreign body, so removing of the foreign body was very essential. So, so far there are 2 case reports from India. This is the first case report that was reported from Lakeshore Hospital in Kochi. And in this case report, basically there was a chicken bone that had caused the liver abscess, and it was endoscopically removed. This is the second case report, and that was done, that was published from the Safdarjung Hospital, New Delhi. So in this case report, they had found a needle in the right lobe of liver, and the patient subsequently underwent surgery for the drainage of the abscess. So to conclude, hepatic abscess diagnosis based on perforation of the GI tract caused by foreign body is difficult due to a variety of non-specific symptoms, and because the patients are often unaware of the ingestion of foreign body. So in a patient with hepatic abscess that does not respond to aspiration and antibiotic therapy, we should look for an etiology like foreign body. Thank you.
We had a similar case a couple of years ago when working in Apollo. This time a 60-year-old lady who presented with weak abdominal symptoms from West Bengal, and they're not able to make out what was the diagnosis. And we thought it is actually there's an abscess just below the left lobe liver in the lesser sac, and when we went in laparoscopically, there was a bone half into the liver and half into the stomach, fish bone. So that should be a third case report, and there should be the fourth one.
Actually, when I was working with Dr. LVK, we saw a patient which we published as an uncommon cause of abdominal pain. Patient had a short duration of abdominal pain. He was actually taking PPIs for GER, for GERD for some 6 months. And he was also having unusual epigastric discomfort with shortness of breath. We were not able to account for his symptoms. He had a cardiac evaluation and they diagnosed him to have a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. But since his symptoms were unusual, so we went ahead with an endoscopy. We saw bone vertically embedded in the antrum. Luckily, there was no perforation. We could remove the bone. So the high index of suspicion is required. This patient, if the patient presents yearly, maybe before perforation, still we need to have a high index of suspicion. Otherwise, nobody would do an endoscopy yearly.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, endoscopic ultrasound can give us an idea about what, till what extent the bone has gone into. Like in our case, it has already crossed the mucosa and probably the submucosa also. So it was probably there in the muscularis. So regarding the layer in which the bone is stuck, probably endoscopic ultrasound can help us in finding out. But so far, no case reports have been published in which any therapeutic removal of the bone can be tried via endoscopic ultrasound, sir.
I know Professor KRP will remember there's one young fellow who had a fishbone in the somewhere in the antrum, and when we opened up, we couldn't make out actually. It's not radio opaque on table, Sir, if you remember, I think he had reoperated in Japan or somewhere. Sir was in the OT and we couldn't exactly locate it, somewhere in the Antrim.
I remember the case, and there was buried in the submucosal area in the antrum. And I think he presented like an abscess. I think he was operated by Dr. Radhakrishna, and he couldn't find the bone. And subsequently, we did a CT and picked up this fish bone. That is not removed, still, it is still in place.
Still there.
In fact, we were planning to send
This
him to
time we
Japan.
can remove, sir.
And he was a sort of well-to-do person. We wanted to go to Japan to remove it, but it's still there.
Even the bacteriology of that abscess, Staphylococcus capitis, is something which is very different from what you get in a pyogenic abscess. And subdiaphragmatic abscess, and we put a pigtail and removed it. It grew salmonella. So he went home, came back, and again there was a reaccumulation. It again grew salmonella even after 6 weeks. Then he has actually undergone a laparoscopic cholecystectomy 2 years back. What exactly happened was there was a small stone which was there in the GB fossa, which has formed a nidus for salmonella. He has undergone a subtotal cholecystectomy because of a very bad gallbladder, and that had kept on giving him this infection. So ultimately, after putting the pigtail, we went and removed that, and he became all right. So I think that different bacteriology also gives you a clue that there has to be something else. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
One more thing is imaging in bones, it depends upon the calcium content of the bone. Most of the times in plain X-rays, they are not picked up. So usually CT helps in.
The fourth presentation is Twist of Fate, Dr. Zamir from Stanley Medical College.
Good evening, respected teachers and August gathering. Today, this evening, I, Dr. Zamir, from Professor Revati Madam's unit of Stanley Medical College, going to present a peculiar case. And I titled this presentation as a twist of fate. And I will be taking this case into following heads. My patient, a 65-year male, farmer by occupation, a resident from Salem, came to us with chief complaints with abdominal pain since 3 months, constipation since 2 months. On elaborating the history, abdominal pain was insidious onset, mainly located in left iliac region. It is colicky and intermittent. It is non-radiating, and there was no definite relation to food. That patient is having occasional vomiting on and off, which is non-bilious and non-projectile. And bowel frequency, patient had 2 to 3 bowels per week, semi-solid to hard in consistency. On Bristol scale, it was 3. However, he doesn't have history of bleeding or mass descending per rectum. But patient have significant history of loss of appetite and weight. There was no history of abdominal distension or awareness of lump in the abdomen, no history of ball rolling movements or fever or GI bleed. Coming to past history, patient doesn't have any similar illness in the past. There is no history of diabetes, mellitus, hypertension, coronary artery disease or tuberculosis. No history of any major medical surgical illness in the past. Patient is a chronic alcohol use disorder. He used to consume 2 units thrice weekly for a past 10 years. And there is no history of smoking or tobacco chewing or high risk behavior. Treatment history. Before coming here, patient visited multiple local hospitals for abdominal pain. He managed as a irritable bowel syndrome, and there was no significant improvement in his symptoms. Summarizing, a 65-year-old male with left iliac fossa pain, constipation with significant loss of appetite and loss of weight. With above history, we suspected having left colonic pathology. On general examination, patient was moderately built, nourished with low BMI, with stable vitals, pallor was present. There was no pedal edema, icterus, clubbing, lymphadenopathy, and no cutaneous markers of internal malignancy. And per abdomen, there was tenderness present in the left iliac region. There were no guarding, rigidity, or no organomegaly, mass palpable per abdomen, no free fluid, and bowel sounds were heard. Per rectum examination was normal. With the above history and examination, we started evaluating the patient. The investigation showed microcytic anemia with altered LFT in the form of azotemia. Other investigations were within normal limits. And stool examination was normal, stool occult blood was negative. And routine imaging, ultrasound showed grade 1 medical renal disease with minimal ascites. And chest X-ray and abdominal X-ray was insignificant, but chest X-ray showed bilateral non-homogeneous upper zone opacities. With minimal ascites, we proceeded with CECT abdomen. CECT abdomen, the CECT abdomen showing the bowel loop, small bowel loops occupying the right iliac, right side of the abdomen with alteration in the vascular, superior mesenteric vein and superior mesenteric artery pattern. This superior mesenteric artery, which should be on left side, is on right side. And there is a cecal and proximal ascending colon narrowing, which is occupying on the left side of the abdomen. And the report showed as non-rotation of the gut with minimal ascites. For further evaluation, we have done barium meal follow-through. This barium meal follow-through showed the DJ loop it should be left side of the vertebral column is on right side, and the small bowel loops are occupying on the right iliac fossa with proximal ascending colon and cecal narrowing, which is on left side of the abdomen. We further proceeded with barium meal enema, which to rule out the large bowel pathology. It showed the proximal ascending colon narrowing with cecal narrowing. And we proceeded with colonoscopy. At the first, colonoscopy was difficult to perform due to altered anatomy of the bowel. Second time, we have done colonoscopy under general anesthesia. We are able to pass up to ileocecal junction, and we found circumferential nodularity involving the ileocecal junction with patulous ileocecal valve. And we have taken biopsy and we have sent the sample for histopathology and CB-NAT. This is a histopathology slide of this ileocecal ulceration showing granuloma with caseous necrosis with Langerhans giant cells, and this blue arrow showing granuloma with caseous necrosis, and this yellow arrow showing the rim of lymphocytes surrounding the granuloma. And biopsy of CB-NAT came positive for tuberculosis with rifampicin sensitive. Our final diagnosis was ileocecal tuberculosis in non-rotation of gut, and we have started ATT. On follow-up, patient symptoms improved. He is gaining weight. Coming to the literature, non-rotation of the gut is a congenital anomaly of the intestine that results in small bowel occupying the right side of the peritoneal cavity and colon predominantly on left. It's sometimes thought as a subtype of intestinal malrotation. Coming to embryology, the midgut develops between 5 to 10 weeks in the fetus. During this time, the midgut tube herniates outside the peritoneal cavity. It subsequently returns to cavity as a sequential manner that involves the rotation of midgut tube. In non-rotation, a large umbilical ring defect allows for a small bowel to descend altogether. This is a normal rotation of gut. There are 3 stages. The first stage showing this is the umbilical ring. There is a herniation of the bowel loops. This is a duodenal jejunal loop, this is a cecal loop. And it will take rotation. The DJ loop takes rotation 180 degrees. It will come to inferior to superior mesenteric artery in the first stage. And cecal loop takes 90 degrees rotation, and it will occupies from inferior to left side of the superior mesenteric artery. In the second stage, the further 90 degrees rotation additional takes place. In the final stage, there will be cecal descending and cecal fixation will take place. The non-rotation mainly occurs due to failure of the first stage of the rotation. This is one of the slide showing this lightly shaded area and darkly shaded area and superior mesenteric artery. This prearterial segment mainly in the first stage will elongates and occupies on the right side of the peritoneal cavity. This post-arterial segment will occupy in the left side. Mostly this non-rotation usually detected incidentally, usually asymptomatic, may present with chronic abdominal pain or discomfort. Sometimes they present with occasional bilious vomiting due to intermittent volvulus. When I am searching the literature, I found some of the case reports. This is one of the case report. This is a non-rotation causing obstruction in adults. Usually the non-rotation causes obstruction in infants and children. This is one of the case report causing non-rotation in adults due to intestinal volvulus. The incidence is 1:500 live births, usually detected due to recent incidental anomaly. My take-home message is not all left iliac fossa pain are due to irritable bowel syndrome. Systemic alarm symptoms should always be persecuted. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
One more DD which we usually think of is appendigitis in left iliac pain and no other GI symptoms. So,
If no questions, we'll close it. When do you give the prize? No?
Yes, sir. Initially, while doing colonoscopy, initially we are unable to pass through the
because
transverse
we have
colons.
done a lot of ERCP in situs inversa, but the colonoscopy. So, what are the technical difficulties you encounter?
Initially, we are able to difficult to pass through the transverse colon, sir. After that, unable to reach the transverse colon. Next, we have done colonoscopy under general anesthesia, sir.
No,
Second
general
time,
anesthesia for the
second
comfort
time-
of the patient.
yes, sir.
The movement you have to do is little different from the routine colonoscopy.
Second
Okay.
time, there was no difficulty, sir. Second time.
The moral of the story is not that second time will be less difficult. Wherever you have to turn right side or clockwise rotation, you have to turn anti-clockwise rotation. And for the patient comfort, and you want to make sure you are going general anesthesia. So should not go with the idea of general anesthesia and second time you will succeed or not. The most important is, probably you would not have noticed, you go from here and to the sigmoid, then transverse. Here you have to do the different maneuvers, you have to do that. That is the one. And there is chances of perforation is very high if you are not very careful. Suppose he was very lucky enough that, he knew that before doing colonoscopy itself, there was situs inversus. There are cases where people just prepare the colon and do it and can perforate it. So this is the very important lesson you have to know that. Like you fixing the papilla in situs inversus, you're doing ERCP, it's totally different maneuvers you do that. Otherwise you may perforate it. So perforation chance was very high. So make sure that before starting colonoscopy, and once in a way, it's very rare that you are not doing the right. If you are not proceeding further, you think of maybe some situs inversus. That's the one I want to tell you.
Thank you, sir.
I think we had very interesting case presentations, and we were asked to judge which is the best case presentation here. I think all of them were pretty good, but only one of them could impress. So we decided this case presentation, abdominal aquarium, probably from Apollo Hospital, Chennai, steals the show today. And they've been awarded as one of the best presentation for today evening. Thank you.
To deliver this report.
Good evening, all. And we have new members, Dr. Joy Mon from a pediatric hepatologist and Hari Kumar Nair, hepatologist. And we successfully completed our first multi-center study projects. I think the entire study will be presented in the next month annual conference. I request all the study participants to be in Coimbatore for the presentations. And I think one of the largest multi-center study carried across India in multi-center projects. And Dr. Epan is and Professor Jayanti, we are very grateful to you to initiate this study. And because of your motivation, we thought we will be having a multi-center study projects. We probably choose 5 best study projects in the coming year and start working on it. And as I already mentioned, please share your publication in the last 2 years. We thought of felicitating the best publication in the last 2 years in the coming ISG. And also request PGs to come forward to present the posters. Again, the 6 best poster presentations will be allowed for a oral presentation on the next day of the annual ISG. And I request Professor LVK, who is here, and he will give about our annual conference.
Respected members and colleagues and postgraduates, this is just to inform all of you that the annual conference of the Tamil Nadu Indian Society of Gastroenterology is being held at Coimbatore. It's being held on 7th and 8th March. It starts on 7th morning and ends up by lunch on 8th afternoon. We have carefully scripted a program. I think it has come out fairly okay, and I request all the members, the faculty, the chairpersons, and the delegates to come to register for the conference, to attend this conference. This is our own society meeting. We could not accommodate everybody as a faculty or chairperson, but I request all the members of the Tamil Nadu ISG, and especially the postgraduates of all the institutes here, to attend this conference on 7th and 8th. I request all the poster presentations can be sent to TNISGCon 2020. I think by tomorrow, if you could send all the posters. All the posters will be displayed on both days, on 7th and 8th, as an e-poster. But we will select about 6 posters for the next day's plenary presentation. And for the postgraduates, rupees 2,000 will be given by the society for the travel allowances, and we'll make arrangements for their stay. So that's taken care of. And I request all of you to attend this conference and send your posters for this thing. I once again request all the members, first, every member, every faculty delegate should register and then attend this conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Coming to today's meeting, and this is going on for quite some time, and Dr. Professor BSR is thinking about starting an IBD forum. Particularly, he thinks about whether we'll start in Chennai, and I thought, why don't we take it across Tamil Nadu, and so that we call everybody across Tamil Nadu to start a forum. Basically, once we gave the name, and I thought what we do. So initially we thought we'll have a meeting, and we have certain faculties in our mind and call up to have a meeting. And basically further proceed on, we try to have some multi-center studies as well as we'll have a separate question and answer session on our website, and maybe we will conduct webinars regularly. That is our basic idea. And maybe we will discuss at the end of the meeting any other thoughts. And now I request Prem to proceed further. Thank you.
Now we move on to the next part of the program. May I request the chairpersons, Dr. A.R. Venkateshwaran, Dr. Patta Radhakrishna, Dr. M. Srinivas, and Dr. Kani Sheikh to take over and conduct the proceedings.
He's come. Good evening. We welcome the gathering, and it is IBD forum starts off with a presentation by a young female from Madurai, South Tamil Nadu, on 5-ASA, steroids, immunomodulators. I have observed Alagami for more than 7 to 10 years. She has got the first prize in the TISA award. She is growing in stature. One of my students, she was a mentor, and she is doing a lot of procedures. And I want to hear what is new and what is catching up in these 3 topics with respect to IBD. Over to Alagami.
Respected teachers, professors, seniors and friends, it's my privilege to be here in this evening. Thank you for the opportunity. Actually the topic which was first assigned was to speak on non-biologic therapy in Crohn's disease, and later it was changed as only 5-ASA, steroids and immunomodulators, only to focus more on therapy rather than speaking broad and speaking everything about Crohn's disease. So it is changed to be more focused. So these are my references. So if we have to speak on management of Crohn's disease, only drugs, then also it will take a day or 2 to cover everything. So to make it more interesting and crisp, particularly to be useful to the junior PGs here, I thought of designing the slides in this way. For each category, what are the rolling questions? Daily we have these questions. Let the questions be answered in the form of short discussions. So with regard to steroids, always there is a question, what is the preferred steroid, whether I should use budesonide or go for conventional steroids, and what would be the ideal dose and how to taper. How to taper is always a question. So with regard to budesonide CR, it is released primarily in the terminal ileum and ascending colon. So it is only for ileocecal disease and not for all patients with Crohn's disease. So and that too, it's only for mild to moderate ileocecal disease. The budesonide MMX multimatrix formulation, it is designed to be released in the colon. I don't think it is currently available in the market, and so we are left with budesonide CR now. So we can use budesonide only in ileocecal disease. So it is considered to be a topical anti-inflammatory steroid which acts in terminal ileum and right colon, and it's a drug of choice in mild to moderate ileocecal disease. We can start with 9 mg per day as a once daily dose or 3 tablets of 3 mg, which is to be given in the same dose for next 6 to 10 weeks, assessing the clinical response. And once clinical response is attained, it can be tapered over next 1 to 2 weeks. So the previous thought was to give it for a long time. It can be given for 6 months, 9 months. It's not like that. We can give only for 12 weeks. The advantage of budesonide is that it has got lesser adverse effects due to high first-pass metabolism in the liver. 90% of budesonide is going to be metabolized in the liver, so it doesn't reach the systemic circulation. So the systemic side effects of routine conventional steroids, we are not going to see with budesonide. So the conventional steroids have a role in severe Crohn's disease at any location, including the ileocecal region. If it is severe Crohn's disease, we are going to use conventional steroids. Obviously, biologics will be extensively covered in the next talk. So we are focusing on the step-up therapy. So the dose of prednisolone is 0.5 to 0.75 milligram per kilogram, the maximum dose of 60 milligram, which is to be tapered over next 8 weeks to 12 weeks. So we often see a small dose started and continued for 3 months, 6 months. So it should not be the case. We should start with an appropriate dose, then only it is going to work, and we should not be giving continuously for a long time. We should be able to taper and stop by 3 months. Oral route is a preferred route. However, in an initial acute phase, we can use IV steroids for a rapid action. So the dose of steroid, you can see these two studies are from 70s and 80s. I took this from the Indian Task Force Consensus Statement. So this dose was designed so long back, 30, 40 years back, and it is being used. So, but even now when we see the practice, we do see prescriptions of 4 milligram methyl prednisolone, 5 milligram prednisolone given, which should not be practiced. So duration, as discussed, it is only for induction of remission and it's not for maintenance of remission, not to be given beyond 12 weeks. By the time the patient is not responding, that means he is steroid non-responder and we have to switch over to next level and should not continue steroids as such. So coming to thiopurines, we have these questions often asked. Our mind is asking all these questions, how to answer. So what is the mechanism of action of thiopurines, how to choose the correct dose, and what is the role of TPMT and NUDT testing, and how to monitor for side effects. So thiopurines, they are the drug of choice for maintenance of remission achieved in moderate to severe disease. So they take minimum of 16 weeks to act. So hence they are not for induction therapy and they are for maintenance therapy. Azathioprine, thiopurine monotherapy is considered to be the choice for maintenance of remission in Crohn's disease. So this metabolism is very important to understand, not only the mechanism of action, but also to study and assess the myelotoxicity and hepatotoxicity, and also to understand where the TPMT and the NUDT 15 stands, and also to adjust the dose so that we achieve a good clinical response before deciding or concluding that the patient is azathioprine resistant patient. So this metabolism is very important to understand. So it's actually the thiopurines, azathioprine, which get converted to 6-mercaptopurine, is shunted by the TPMT to form 6-methyl-mercaptopurine, which is actually inert, but it has got hepatotoxicity. The active component is thioguanine. So 6-thioguanine is the active component which is going to cause the clinical response. It inhibits the DNA synthesis. It gets incorporated to the DNA and prevents the further division of DNA and ultimately inhibit lymphocyte proliferation. So it's a immunomodulatory drug. It's not a routine chemotherapeutic agent. It is a immunomodulatory drug. It inhibits the lymphocyte proliferation. So our job is to achieve a good concentration of 6-thioguanine so that our clinical response will be good. Suppose if a patient is having a very high TPMT activity, Suppose if a patient is having a very high TPMT activity, much of the drug is going to be shunted in this pathway and we are going to achieve a less concentration of 6-thioguanine. So we may be thinking that we are giving an adequate dose of even up to 2.5 milligram per kilogram body weight and the patient is not achieving clinical response, but actually the patient may be having a very high TPMT activity and that is the reason that he is not achieving a response. So before switching over to biologicals, if we could measure the level of 6-thioguanine and 6-methyl-mercaptopurine, we can come to a conclusion what dose we can adjust so that we can achieve a clinical response before switching over to biologicals, because using biologicals is always difficult in our scenario due to cost. So azathioprine dose is 1.5 to 2.5 milligram per kilogram and 6-mercaptopurine is a metabolite, so it is a lesser dose of 1 to 1.5 milligram per kilogram. So usually we start at low dose and the point is we should not stop with low dose. So we should not stop with low dose and expect the patient to respond to low dose. We should always hike up the dose with close monitoring of patient. So we should increase every 2 to 3 weeks based on the blood counts and clinical response. What is often seen in the clinical practice is to give a very small dose of 50 milligram, 75 milligram, thinking that the patient may come back with myelosuppression. I should be cautious and not increasing the dose. So that should not be the practice. We should be courageously increasing the dose with monitoring, obviously. So here TPMT helps us to decide the dose. So this is actually, this percentage given is for Caucasian population. 89% of population, if you do the genotype for TPMT, they are going to have a wild type. That is, they will have a normal TPMT activity. So that means we can give a routine dose, that is a designed dose of 1.5 to 2.5 milligrams. Start with the low dose and go up with every 2 to 3 weeks monitoring of blood counts and clinical response. 11% are going to have a heterozygous for mutant allele. That means they are going to have a mutation. suppression. So they are not going to have the normal TPMT activity, it is a low activity. So if it is a low TPMT, as we saw in the previous metabolism chart, much of the thiopurine is going to be used up for producing 6-thioguanine because the TPMT is less. So more 6-thioguanine will be produced. So we are going to have a good clinical response, but at the same time, higher concentration of 6-thioguanine is going to land up with myelotoxicity. So we don't want that bone marrow suppression to occur. So we should start with a lower dose, the same 1.5 milligram per kilogram. In that only 30% we are going to start, and then go up with gradually go up with monitoring of blood counts. Obviously, in this patient, we are not going to reach the high dose. We are going to reach only a smaller dose ultimately. 0.3% of the patients are homozygous for mutant allele. That is, they are not having any TPMT activity, absent TPMT activity. So this is a patient that we should never use azathioprine. So we should only consider alternative drugs. We should never use even a very small dose of 20%, 30% also we should not be using. So TPMT is going to help us to pick up these patients and to decide on what dose we have to start and how to go up and what the maximum dose we can reach. But however, as we all know, this NUDT15 has picked up much in Asians. Because the prevalence of TPMT mutation among Asians is much lesser when compared to Caucasian population. We saw it is 11% in Caucasians, and studies have shown it is only 3% in Asians. But paradoxically, the percentage of patients who are going to develop myelotoxicity is much more higher than the Caucasian population. So GWAS was conducted in many of the Asian centers, and they found the new other gene variant which is associated with the myelotoxicity, which is the NUDT15 gene variant. This is a nucleic acid diphosphate moiety, which is involved in the final steps of metabolism of thioguanine triphosphate to thioguanine monophosphate. So if this gene has got a mutant variant, the thioguanine metabolism is affected, and which results in higher thioguanine levels and leading to myelotoxicity. So this mutation is strongly associated with thiopurine myelotoxicity in Asians. And this is an Indian study from Hinduja, where they showed that the NUDT genotyping is much more sensitive and much more specific for possible myelosuppression than the TPMT assay. So they did TPMT as well as NUDT for a group of patients, around 206 patients, and found that NUDT is much more superior. So what we should do for our patient is NUDT15 genotyping and not TPMT. And this statement I just copy pasted from this from Asia Pacific IBD Forum's consensus statement published last year. So in the Asian population, NUDT15 genotyping prior to thiopurine commencement is recommended if available. So I think it should be made available everywhere, and we should start using for a safer use of azathioprine as well as a better use of azathioprine, because we are going to use higher dose in a courageous way. So marrow suppression is the thing which worries us all. As we discussed, it correlates with high thioguanine level. It can happen early as well as late. It's not that patient is taking for 1 year and it's not going to happen now. TPMT testing is useful as we discussed, but it is never going to substitute counts monitoring as well as NUDT15. So we should, even if we have a patient who is having a wild type TPMT or a good metabolite, NUDT15 as a wild type, then also we should keep the patient on counts monitoring. It's not a substitute for not monitoring the counts. So we should monitor count whenever we start azathioprine, once in 2 weeks for the first 2 months, and thereafter monthly for 4 months. When we achieve a stable dose, then thereafter we can make it as every 3 months. Whenever we increase the dose, for example, if you have a patient who was on 1.5 milligram per kilogram body weight azathioprine and he has come with a relapse, and we have used a second course of steroids, and now we have increased the dose of azathioprine. Now also the patient should be again put on the same schedule of once in 2 weeks for 2 months, monthly for 4 months, and thereafter every 3 months after achieving a stable dose. So, and we should react to the total count also in the same way. If we see a low total count of less than 4,000, we should reduce the dose by 50% if the total count is more than 3,000 and absolute neutrophil count of more than 1,500. If the total count is less than 3,000, we should stop. So when we stop, we should monitor even more closely to find out whether the patient is recovering. So thereafter, for next 1 week or every 10 days, we should monitor to make sure patient is recovering. If there is a persistent cytopenia after reducing the dose, we should stop the medicine. Other adverse effects are hepatotoxicity. So we have to monitor LFT every 3 months. Obviously, there is increased chance of infection because of T cell depletion, and the chance of malignancy that increases with increasing successful years of treatment. And the pancreatitis. Pancreatitis is not dose dependent, typically occurs in first 3 months. If the patient develops pancreatitis, drug to be withdrawn. Whereas with the myelosuppression and hepatotoxicity, still we can use the drug in a modified dose with close monitoring. In pancreatitis, we should stop the drug. So then comes the therapeutic drug monitoring, as we discussed already. So we can measure both the 6-methyl mercaptopurine and 6-thiaguanine. I think some centers in Tamil Nadu, particularly CMC, is doing this regularly, but it is not widely available because we cannot outsource this test like we are doing for TPMT, because this is done in fresh RBCs. Whereas TPMT genotype, we send and wait for the report to come after 4-5 days. We outsource and we send somewhere, but this we cannot do. We have to do in our own center. So it's not feasible for everyone. But this is very, very useful if we can do. So we can find out if the patient is non-compliant. Suppose the patient is non-compliant with the dose that we are giving, both 6-methyl mercaptopurine and 6-thiaguanine level will be less. If the patient is having a very high TPMT activity, the 6-thiaguanine level will be less and 6-methyl mercaptopurine will be high. So the patient will not have clinical response. So we can hike up the dose in that patient, or we can add allopurinol to increase the effect of azathioprine. So the target range of 6-thiaguanine is between 230 to 450 picomole per 8 into 10 power 8 erythrocytes. More than 450 can cause myelotoxicity. Liver toxicity is observed with high levels of 6-methyl mercaptopurine. So accordingly, we can adjust the drugs, and allopurinol can be used if we have the facility to measure these two end products. So coming to methotrexate, we all know methotrexate is always there in the algorithm of treatment of Crohn's disease, but often it's not clearly known when to just use methotrexate and stop azathioprine and go for methotrexate. And what is the route of administration, whether I can follow my rheumatology friends and give it as oral, or I should give only as parenteral route, and what are the side effects that I should monitor for. So it's for maintenance of remission in patients with thiopurine intolerance. Why thiopurine intolerance alone we are using methotrexate and not directly using methotrexate is the side effects with methotrexate is much more higher when compared to adverse events with thiopurine. So that's why we are reserving it as an alternative therapy if the patient is not tolerating thiopurine. For example, if we have a azathioprine patient who has developed pancreatitis and we can never use the drug, so in such patients we can consider methotrexate. Rarely there was a very big study which showed methotrexate could be used as an inducing agent in steroid refractory patient. I'll come to that. That was NEJM article 1990. So I just put it in a nutshell. I thought I'll take the Cochrane review because it's difficult to review all the articles in a very short time. So this methotrexate for maintenance of remission in Crohn's disease, this is a Cochrane article which concluded that intramuscular methotrexate 15 mg per week is effective for maintenance of remission, achieving a remission in up to 65% of the patient compared to 39% of placebo patients. Oral methotrexate is not effective due to variable bioavailability. This is for maintenance of remission. And there have been a lot of studies comparing the pharmacokinetics of subcutaneous methotrexate and intramuscular methotrexate, and they found that the pharmacokinetics are very much similar. So we can extrapolate all the studies that have used intramuscular methotrexate to subcutaneous methotrexate also. So subcutaneous will be a preferred mode because of ease of administration and obviously less painful, and patient can administer himself or herself like insulin. So we can better use for subcutaneous methotrexate 15 mg per week as a effective way of maintaining the achieved remission. There have been studies showing oral methotrexate to be beneficial. So for our patient, if the patient is in continued clinical remission, probably we can switch over to oral, assess whether the patient is maintaining remission with an idea of switching back to subcutaneous if there is a lack of clinical response. So for induction, this is the NEJM article I told, which is quoted in this Cochrane review. A high dose IM methotrexate of 25 mg per week is useful for induction of remission in patients steroid refractory patients. However, there is no role of any oral methotrexate induction. An addition of methotrexate to biologicals have not been shown to add extra benefit. So generally, immunomodulators are not used for induction of remission because of the delayed action that we are seeing in these patients. So they are used only for maintenance of remission. The more common, the methotrexate, as I said, it has got very high level of adverse events when compared to thiopurines. It's 63% versus 26%. So that's why they're not used as first line. Severe adverse events are the hepatotoxicity. Often we see our rheumatology and ortho colleagues sending to us for an altered LFT for a methotrexate patient, and we don't know when to take fibroscan, when to take liver biopsy. So we should be monitoring these patients for altered LFT, and if they have persistently altered LFT, then we have to take a liver biopsy. A fibroscan is always a non-invasive test to find out development of fibrosis in a patient who has got a higher cumulative dose. Pneumonitis, marrow suppression, nephrotoxicity are usual adverse events of high-dose methotrexate and less commonly observed at the low dose that we are using for Crohn's disease. The thing is, methotrexate is contraindicated in CKD and pregnancy because methotrexate is excreted in the renal route. So coming to 5-ASA, we have two major questions. Does it still have a role in management of Crohn's disease is a major question. And if so, when and what formulation? So the clear-cut ECHO and BSG guidelines, clear-cut statement, 5-ASA has no role in induction of remission or maintenance of medically achieved remission. Here, shall I kindly request anybody who is not using 5-ASA in Crohn's to put up the hands? 4, 5. 5 out of maybe 150, 100. So I think still we are using, though the guidelines clear-cut state that we should not use. They are not telling that we should not use, they are telling that there is no role. But practically, and as mentioned in the Indian Task Force consensus statement also, if there is a survey conducted among the practicing gastroenterologists, almost all of them are using 5-ASA, both in induction regimen as well as maintenance regimen, except very few in the questionnaire survey. It was shown that 4% did not use. Here also almost the same number is coming. So there is a conflicting data. There are data to support that 5-ASA is superior to placebo. There are data to support that 5-ASA is equal to corticosteroids. Statistically significant difference is not there between corticosteroids and 5-ASA in achieving remission. But at the same time, there are a lot of data telling that it is not superior to placebo. So that's why it is a conflicting data, but practically used by almost all. So probably we should confine ourselves to use in very selected patients. For example, I will give a case scenario. If a 50-year-old lady, she is having a mild ileocecal disease. So she has come to us with some 1-month abdominal pain, and we are diagnosing her to have terminal ileal ulcers, localized disease, and she is having mild CDI, mild activity. So we are using budesonide for induction of remission. How to maintain her? Are we really going to give azathioprine for her to maintain when she is having a mild disease and she has immediately responded to budesonide and she is having a short duration disease and she is so well preserved? So how long to give azathioprine? Are we going to choose azathioprine which is going to have high adverse events, or we will choose mesalamine for maintenance? So very selected patients based on the data available, probably they are mild disease patients, probably we can use ASA, as we are all using actually, but definitely no as a monotherapy in severe disease. So it should not be used as a monotherapy at all. So induction is with steroids or with biologics, and maintenance azathioprine monotherapy is recommended, and never 5-ASA as a monotherapy for maintenance in moderate to severe disease. Obviously there are data to support that 5-ASA has got a good role in post-operative prophylaxis when it is used in higher dose. It is definitely superior to placebo, but may not be as effective as azathioprine. So we have various formulations, both oral and rectal. Rectal preparations of 5-ASA have not been studied in RCTs for Crohn's disease. They are mainly for ulcerative colitis. With regard to oral preparation, we still use sulfasalazine high dose in colonic Crohn's disease when we have a mild colonic Crohn's disease. And we have this pH-based, I will come to this, pH-dependent release and time-dependent release formulations. The pH-dependent release the mesalamine, 5-ASA compound, the terminal ileum and colon, so it is okay to use in ileocolonic or colonic disease, whereas the time-dependent release is the ethyl cellulose encapsulated medicines, which are released both in small bowel and large bowel. So it's up to the treating physician whether to choose this or not. But this is the mechanism of action, and we may use in mild disease in a very selected group and not as a routine drug for everybody. For example, it is routinely given for a patient who we are giving steroid for induction, we add mesalamine as a routine. That should be avoided, I feel. Thank you.
The question session
After
is after the speakers, according to the
Okay,
format here. Now, on behalf of the Tamil Nadu chapter of ISG, I take pride in welcoming Professor Vinit Ahuja to the stage to deliver a talk on the role of biologics in inflammatory bowel disease. Professor Ahuja is a professor of gastroenterology and associate dean at the prestigious All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Delhi. Welcome, sir.